All right, we will get started. It is 9:30. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healing Community Study Learning Collaborative. My name is Lisa Romley, and I am the Education Program Coordinator for the HEAL Study. We're here today to discuss and learn ways to be grant ready and eligible, and learn how to effectively manage federal grants. I just need to review a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded today. And if your screen name is not your full name, you're using either a partial name or you're using your phone, if you could please update it and change it to your full name. So to change your name, you just click on the More button, which is right next to your name, and then click on Rename and type your full name in there. This helps when we compare the participants' names in the session to our registration list. We are offering CE credits for today's session. One CE credit has been approved for physicians, pharmacists, nurses, social workers, and licensed drug and alcohol counselors. And I'll give you instructions on how to obtain a CE credit at the end of the session. We do ask that you stay on mute if you're not speaking, and that helps reduce the echo and extraneous noises. And if you have questions for today's session, and we do encourage your questions, please use either the raise hand feature, which you'll find on the bottom of your screen. You can click on reactions and then click on the raised hand icon, or you can type your questions in the chat box and we'll read them during the session. Kim has asked that you ask questions throughout the session and she'll stop to answer them. And she would prefer it that way instead of just waiting to the end of the session. Oops. Just to announce that Kim has stated that she does not have any relevant financial relationships to disclose. And the practice gaps that we are identified as employers and employees that are applying for grants are not often familiar with the eligibility criteria and the process to manage grants, resulting in a waste of time and money. And the educational needs being addressed is understanding federal grant criteria and processes for management of federal grants will help employees and employers gain confidence and increase the likelihood that they will apply for a federal grant and manage them effectively. The learning objectives for today's session, we're going to be discussing federal regulations associated with accepting federal grants, explain eligibility criteria, identify the required documents when applying for a grant, and review the required processes, systems, and internal controls necessary for managing a federal grant. And by the end of the session, hopefully you'll understand the required documents needed and understand the process of managing a federal grant. I am so pleased to welcome our speaker for today's Learning Collaborative session, Kim Carter. She is the Associate Vice President for Research and Executive Director with the Office of Sponsored Project Administration at the University of Kentucky. Ms. Carter previously held position of Associate Director with the Office of Sponsored Programs at Ohio State University. She was also then Acting Director of Grants and Sponsored Research at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and held several positions in research administration at the University of Pittsburgh. She holds a master's degree in public administration with a focus on management of nonprofit organizations. Ms. Carter is a certified research administrator and holds professional certifications in pre-award and financial research management. She is also currently the immediate past president of the Society of Research Administrators International. It's a premier professional organization for research administrators. We welcome Kim Carter to today's session. So let me stop sharing, Kim, so Kim can pull up her slides.
Okay, I think you can probably see it. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity. We're going to talk about what it is you need to have in place in order to receive and then successfully manage a sponsored project that is funded by the federal government. I understand that in the previous session, you talked about putting a proposal together. And another key thing you need to think about while you're putting the proposal together and thinking about getting federal funding is what are all those other requirements that the federal government layers on top of you in order to have your proposal received and reviewed, and then be able to manage the funds should the federal agency give you an award for your programs or services. So the first thing we're going to discuss are the required registrations. These registrations have to be completed before you ever even submit that grant application, and absolutely must be in place in order to receive federal awards. Some of them are one-time registrations, and others are required each time you submit an application. The government has an online system called SAM, System for Award Management. And that system is set up to sort of screen and register any entity that wants to do business with the federal government. Not just a federal assistance award like you would be receiving, but also contractors, vendors, other entities that want to do business with the federal government. In order to register, you have to not only fill in the online information, but you also have to send a notarized letter that would be signed by your authorized official. When I say authorized official in terms of a nonprofit, we're talking about perhaps the president, the treasurer, someone in your organization who is authorized to commit your organization to what you're proposing and the terms and conditions of an award you might receive. I think one key point to make about most of these registrations is that we tend to think of doing things online as being instantaneous. Not always true when we're registering within financial systems or other systems of the federal government. So you want to make sure that you start the process early, and that for the SAM registration, for example, it could take up to 2 weeks. In addition to registering on SAM, you also need to have what used to be called the DUNS number, but is now called the UEI, a unique entity ID. And that is within the federal government system, a number that is unique to your organization. It's automatically signed if you already have a DUNS number, but if not, it can take up to 5 weeks to get that registration processed. So as you can see, registering in SAM and then getting your UEI, if you don't already have one, can take up to 7 weeks. That's why I think it's important to start thinking about these requirements as you're considering what funding you might like to pursue from the federal government. Some of the information I'm providing will be specific to NIH, National Institutes of Health, because I understand that's likely to be a funding source that you would be interested in. And so ERA Commons is an NIH tool, and it is used to manage receipt of proposals, process them through their review system, and then manage awards after they're received and while your project is in progress. Except for the grant application, which goes through grants.gov, we'll talk about that in just a minute, all other actions for NIH take place in this ERA Commons. And one of the things that you need in order to be successful in using ERA Commons is a Commons ID. So you will register for a Commons ID so that you can then have an ability to log into the system. The ERA Commons is not just so that you have access, it's also so that the federal government can see the status of various actions related to your funding, and then ensure that you're properly taking all of the steps necessary. So yes, my understanding is you will get the slides. And some of the slides have more information than probably you really need today, but you can use them for reference later when you get ready to actually step forward and apply for a grant. This is the system for award management we just mentioned, SAM, and it emphasizes the fact that the grants officers need the information that you put into SAM in order to be able to issue an award to you. They need to know things like your UEI, your authorized official's name, the official address for your institution. They get that information from SAM. Grants.gov, Kathy Gretsch in the previous session may have mentioned that as the federal government's online portal for submission of applications to federal agencies. Now, not all federal agencies use grants.gov, and some federal agencies that previously used grants.gov are now sort of modernizing and moving on to other systems. For example, National Science Foundation is using what's called research.gov. But for NIH proposals and other federal agencies, you can use grants.gov as your portal to submit the application. That registration we talked about previously, which you only have to do once, is what gets you into grants.gov. I thought it would be helpful to share with you some of the overriding federal regulations and agency requirements. It is true that each agency interprets the federal regulations somewhat differently, especially when a new regulation comes out. But the ones that I'm going to show you today are sort of tried and true, have been around for a very long time, and there's a lot of consistency among federal agencies. So cost accounting standards are sort of the biggest umbrella when you're thinking about charging expenses to a federal award. And it requires you to meet certain criteria or standards when you are making those expenses. So the federal government uses it to make sure that your budget is allowable. It only includes costs the federal government would be willing to pay for, and then to approve the budget so that an award could be submitted. They're looking at things like, is the pricing of the proposed effort or personnel time in your budget consistent with your accounting system and your practices? And have the costs been appropriately proposed and then expensed later as direct costs or indirect costs? We'll give you those definitions in a minute. And if there are like circumstances, they expect the budget to be consistent. And then there are times, if you do not follow CAS, that you might have to repay some of the funds back to the federal government. That's why, partly why we're having some of these conversations, and why understanding the federal regulations and then complying with them is really important. I think the last thing you want to do is have the excitement and the abilities that come from getting federal funding and then realizing that you have to repay some of those costs. All of the federal regulations are codified. There are public laws, and then there's a Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. I've given you some of those references on some of these slides, should you want to look at them later. My experience has been, it's really good to know what's in there. Definitely know the basic parameters in which you need to function, but it's probably not going to be exciting reading in terms of like reading a novel before you go to bed, for example. But if you have questions, going back to the specific language, I think can be very helpful in your interpretation. Much of what the federal government issues in terms of regulations are not clear cut. So sort of more gray. And so there is interpretation. I would encourage you to have conversations with colleagues at other institutions when you get to that point, because best practices have been established and following those will likely keep you out of trouble. And you won't necessarily see every answer that you're looking for in the actual federal regulation. I think one of the key points in terms of cost accounting standards is the last note on the slide, which is what's really important is to ensure your actual accounting practices are consistent with what you've disclosed to the federal government. Auditors are very happy when you have correct practices and policies, and that it's even more important to them that you actually follow the policies and practices that you have.
Kim, I think Joe is making just a comment. The terms we get from Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Acts are allowable, reasonable, and necessary.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So the regulation that's applicable to nonprofits is 2 CFR 200, most commonly referred to as Uniform Guidance, or UG. And it is the cost principles that you need to follow as you're proposing and then managing federal awards. The intent of UG is really, from a federal government's perspective, is to ensure they bear their fair costs of the program or the project that's being funded, not more than they should, and not costs that would not be considered appropriate to the project or the program. And the uniform guidance is used by those federal agencies for them to really determine whether or not what you're charging them for your program or service is allowable, since it's being funded by a federal award. There are some key points within the uniform guidance. I provided some examples, not all inclusive, but to give you some sense of what uniform guidance is really addressing. And one of those is internal controls. So internal controls are really those policies and practices that your organization has in place that ensures confidential information is kept confidential. There's less likelihood for inadvertently misusing the funds of the federal government. Policies and procedures that ensure individuals know what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. Some examples would be, making sure that you securely store your passwords. Makes common sense, but really important when you're using federal funds. Keeping your debit cards and your passwords in 2 different locations. Having checks and balances in segregation of duties, for example, and making sure that you have SOPs, standard operating procedures, that you're following. In terms of purchasing, or the federal government calls it procurement, the key is to ensure integrity in your purchasing process. So you want to make sure that your purchasing is done ethically, that you have specific reasons for using specific vendors, that you don't have kickbacks and unfair advantages provided to vendors within your purchasing decisions. If you are working with other organizations to complete your program or service, you're probably using what the federal government considers a sub-recipient or a consortium or a collaborator. And uniform guidance has requirements about how you monitor those sub-recipients. So you're responsible for assessing any risk that might be associated with that other organization that's working with you, as well as monitoring them to ensure that they properly perform the work and the reporting that is required by the federal award. Cost principles are a big part of uniform guidance, and again, making sure that you only charge allowable costs. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between direct and indirect in just a minute. And then audit determination, and really what what uniform guidance helps you do is understand what is the documentation, the policies, the SOPs that you need to have in place in order to sufficiently meet the expectation of federal auditors should they come and audit your program or service. I've mentioned direct costs and indirect costs, and thanks to Joe Paul for providing the clarification of the terminology. So yes, allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable to your project are all key terms used within uniform guidance. So the direct costs are those costs that you can specifically identify as necessary and part of the work that you performed for the program or service. So you know, for example, that travel was specifically related to that grant. That personnel specifically spent part of their time working on the grant. So for nonprofits, if the activities you're doing are primarily as a service to members or clients or the general public, when significant and necessary to your organization, those costs must be treated as direct costs, as long as they're allowable. I'll talk a little bit about allowable. And there are examples specifically in uniform guidance. So again, internal control is a huge part of the federal government's interest and regulations. So it's really good to test your systems to make sure that you have the internal controls necessary to comply. And I have some examples of what that might look like. So in order for something to be a direct cost and have it charged to a federal award, it needs to meet all of these criteria. So basically it has to be necessary to complete the scope of work, and it has to be reasonable. A reasonable person would assume that you would need that cost in order to perform that program or service. You have to have documentation. Documentation is a recurring theme within uniform guidance and complying with federal regulations. So if you have an expense, you should have documentation behind it. The regulations restrict you from charging anything that the federal government has said you cannot charge. So for example, you might have an award where you are not allowed to charge a particular cost. So you can't charge it. That's what the regulations say. It has to be consistent with your own policies and your procedures. And again, as mentioned before, you have to uniformly apply those and follow your policies and procedures. You have to make sure that if it's a direct expense on one federal project, that you treat it the same as a direct expense on another federal project. And you can't charge the federal government more than once. So if a cost has been charged to a particular federal award, you can't charge the same project, the same cost to another project. Makes basic accounting sense. And then there are requirements for prior approvals for different rebudgets or changes that you might make within the award budget that you've been given. Any questions about direct cost?
This is Joe Paul again. Generally in the state, we can't charge anything that's not in our scope of work.
So there are certain awards that we would call line item restricted. So in terms of costs, you can only charge what you have proposed. If you're also referring to not being able to charge costs for any other activities that aren't included in the award scope of work or activities that are being funded, then you are correct. That is uniformly true, that you cannot change what you're doing for the federal government usually without getting approval. So if you wanted to change the scope of work, for example, you would need the federal government's approval. And that actually is one of the prior written approvals that you would find in uniform guidance. Indirect costs are sort of the flip side of direct costs and go right along with direct costs when they're charged to a project. So indirect costs are those costs that are incurred for a more common or a joint objective that cannot be readily identified with that particular sponsored project. So think about utilities. In a university, it might be the library, the facilities costs, your rent, for example. Those are considered indirect costs. And if you don't already have an established indirect cost rate with the federal government, you could use a de minimis of 10% of your total direct costs, or you could negotiate a rate with the federal government. If you're just starting out with federal funding, you would not be eligible to negotiate a rate with the federal government. So you would be using that 10%. You want to ensure that you include that 10% in your budget or whatever your negotiated rate is if you already have it, because those are real costs. It's real reimbursement of costs that you have within your organization that's associated with performing those programs and services. So indirect costs have to meet the following criteria. So they have to conform to uniform guidance, of course. They have to be supported with appropriate documentation. So you need copies of canceled checks and timesheets and purchase orders that show that you actually incurred expenses. They are calculated as a percentage of your direct costs. So you take your direct cost times 10%, for example, that gives you your indirect costs. And then you add the direct costs and the indirect costs together to get the total cost of the project that you're proposing to the federal government. Again, you can't use those costs and charge them to another federal award. You can't double dip. And then you have to have consistent treatment, as we've mentioned before. Questions about indirect costs? So there are some costs that are unallowable all the time for federal funding, and this is the list. It includes things like lobbying the federal government, fundraising, if your organization had any fines or penalties, if your organization makes contributions and donations to other organizations, and then certain depreciation of your equipment and facilities is not an allowable cost to the federal government. But in general, costs that you incur and you can document and allocate as being used for a specific federal award are allowable to be charged to the federal award. There are even some distinctions that when you get to that point would be important to know. Like, for example, alcohol. In general, alcohol is not an allowable expense. But if you were doing research on the effects of drinking under the influence of alcohol, of course, would be an allowable expense. So sometimes an expense, direct expense, is allowable given the purpose and the intent of the project that you're doing. In addition to the registrations, the federal government asks organizations to provide certain certifications and assurances before giving them federal funding. These are an example of some of them. These are generally done once. However, there are some federal agencies such as USDA agriculture that require the certifications with every proposal that's submitted. So as you start to find sources of funding for your programs and services, you will begin to identify whether you do these once or whether you have to submit it with every application package. So these three are very common. So drug-free workplace, you have to certify that you have notified your employees that the unlawful manufacture, distribution, dispensing, etc. of a controlled substance is prohibited. You've posted information about that at your workplace, and you can make this certification. The second one is regarding lobbying. And so it prohibits recipients of federal grants from using federal funds for lobbying. I imagine there are instances when some of your organizations do lobby to get more federal funding towards the program that you're interested, more funds perhaps to the community that you're working in. And as long as you are not using the federal dollars that you received in a federal award, this does not restrict that. So basically what you're saying is, I will not charge to this specific federal award any cost associated with my lobbying activities. That's what you're certifying to the federal government. And then there is a requirement related to debarment suspension, which is you are certifying to the best of your knowledge that your organization and the individuals working on the project have not been debarred or suspended from doing business with the federal government. I've taken the federal regulations and requirements for National Institutes of Health, since that is an agency that you're interested in, and I've given you a summary of the federal requirements. And then I wanted to also talk to you a little bit about the layering of federal requirements. So we talked a bit about those overriding regulations and certifications that you need to make. And those are not the only things you have to comply with if you're proposing to receive or actually receive federal awards. So you also have to comply with the specific agency's rules. So in NIH, starting from the bottom of the slide up, you have those overriding regulations, and then you have the NIH grants policy statement. You see much of the notifications from their policy statement in that NIH guide for grants and contracts. It's a communication tool for the agency. So the grants policy statement provides specifics about how NIH has interpreted and is implementing federal regulations. So you will find in there specifically what is it they require prior approval for if you want to rebudget or change your project. What is their expectation when they're doing an audit of your institution? So you can find very, very specific information about that agency in their policy statement. And then when you get a notice of award, there could be terms and conditions. So you will get specific terms and conditions in your notice of award. It will often refer back to the policy statement, but it also might include restrictions specific to that award. For example, it might state who the key personnel on the project is, and if those individuals are changed, you will need sponsor approval to make those changes. It might have information and restrictions related to carrying forward any unspent funds you have from one budget year into the next budget year of the award. So it's important to recognize that not only do you have to comply with the overriding regulations, but each federal agency is interpreting those regulations and providing resources such as policy statements and specifics in your award notice. Financial conflict of interest, you might have heard in the broad news, has gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years. And the Public Health Service, again, this is specific to them, is the sort of the forerunner or the front runner of these requirements. They established them several years ago. And what financial conflict of interest does for the federal government is give them a reasonable assurance that the design, conduct, and reporting of the research is free of bias because of any financial conflict or interest that the investigator or key personnel working on the project might have. The key requirement to this is that the organization have an up-to-date, written, enforced FCOI policy. There are definitions and thresholds within this policy. Most relevantly, $5,000 is the financial threshold. And the organization is required to manage any conflicts that might occur. So just because there might be a conflict of interest does not mean that you cannot do the project the federal government is funding, but it does mean that your organization might have to manage it. So there might have to be different lines of reporting, for example, annual reports submitted to someone within your organization with information about a particular individual's interest, regular disclosure, especially if there are changes to financial interests. And then other federal agencies have over the last year or so started to adopt these public health service and NIH requirements. And some of them have established their own. Some of them are a mismatch of PHS and their own regulations. So it's important when you're considering submitting a grant to the federal agency that you have a policy in place and that you understand what that particular agency requires. For example, PHS says that it's required for investigators. So that's a specific person involved in a project based on their role on the project. USDA Agriculture, again, requires that everyone working on a project has to disclose their financial interests. So it will be important to look at the specifics of the agency that you're applying to. And for reference, the public health service agencies who are within this particular regulation are listed on the slide for you. And staying with NIH also has a requirement for investigators who are working on projects that involve human subjects to have training. And they're required to have training throughout the project. And they're required to report, your organization is required to confirm that they have undergone this training. So Joe Paul, surprised the economic development is not on that list. The previous list? This list? Yes, yes. I think economic development, as with all other conflicts, depends on the project that you're doing and the sponsor who's funding the project. So you could have a conflict related to one federal award, and that you could have that same financial interest not be a conflict in a different federal award. So the key is to look at who's funding the project and what is the work that's being done. What is the potential of the conflict? For example, we at the university have faculty who have startup companies, and some of them get funding from that startup company. So we're looking at, when we're looking at their conflict of interest, we're looking at, is there any potential of financial benefit to the individuals involved in the project from having it funded by that startup company? If that same investigator, however, had an award from NIH, there would be less likelihood that there would be any conflict of interest that we would need to, that we would need to manage. So any questions, any other questions about sort of overriding regulations, some of those certifications that you need to make, and the fact that when you're looking at what you need to have in place, you need to look at the sort of broadest umbrella of the regulations, and then the very specifics of the agency's policies, and then your award terms. So briefly, the importance of accountability. So if you accept a federal award, it becomes a legal obligation for your organization. So you assume responsibility for doing the work, and you're accountable for meeting all of the federal regulations in terms of managing the funds, making sure you have policies and procedures in place following them, making sure you can pass an audit, and appropriately reporting on that project. If you're not able to meet those standards, I would first consider not accepting the award, which is why we're really having this workshop, right? So that you can understand what you need up front. But if you're unable to meet them at any point during the award, your funding might be terminated. You might have more federal oversight in any other awards that you get. So you might have to jump through more hoops, provide more documentation, provide more frequent reports, or you might actually, at the worst extreme, be deemed ineligible to receive financial assistance. So being able to meet your full responsibility is important when you accept a financial award. Those obligations, as I mentioned, include financial reporting and auditing. So from an audit perspective, you have to provide documentation and records related to the federally funded parts of your organization. And the idea is to keep it focused, show how you have complied with all of the regulations so that the federal government knows that their funds have been spent properly. Any questions about the sort of legal obligation that comes with getting federal awards? We're going to look at grant management systems and the structures that you can have in place to successfully manage a grant. So having an understanding and adhering to the regulations leads you to a grant management system that includes all of the essential components to comply with the federal regulations. And I think a key piece of information to recognize is that grants management is just not a function that one person within your organization that performs and the rest of the organization doesn't have to pay attention to. So it really is a responsibility that is shared throughout the organization. And you do that with checks and balances, with training, with a full understanding of the policies and procedures so that all parts of your organization are working towards having a grants management system that complies with the federal requirements. So in order to have this successful grant management system, you have to have an accounting structure that provides accurate and complete information about all of the financial transactions that are charged to every federally funded project or program. You have to have those written policies and procedures. You have to have the internal controls, and you have to monitor that those internal controls are being followed. You have to have a financial system that at a minimum documents the source of the funds and how the funds are being used. And then you have to ensure that the costs that you charge the federal government were only incurred during the life of that federal award. So you can't take expenses that occurred previously, shift them over to the federal award, and when the federal award comes to an end, you can't continue to charge, even though you might have funds remaining. So we'll look at the standards that get us to that successful grant management system. Accounting structure, as I mentioned. So you need to have grant expenditure records that are at least as detailed as the categories that you put in your proposal budget that was approved. And you have to account for those funds that you charge the federal government separately so that they're easily identifiable. And that's how we're able to say that they were specifically applicable to that project. And as I mentioned, you can only incur them during the grant period. So there's a specified time frame in which you can spend the federal grant dollars unless you go back to the agency, get prior approval for an extension, for example. So the accounting records need to be maintained on a current basis and balanced regularly. Best practice, at least monthly. The records have to have that source documentation. They have to be retained for 3 years after the end of the financial award, meaning you've submitted your financial report, your final report to the federal government. They have to include all activities or effort reports, time records for personnel whose salary was charged to the federal award, whether in part or wholly. And then you do have a requirement to do some after the fact determination of what the employee's actual time and effort, how it was spent. You're only allowed to request federal funds that meet your immediate cash needs. So for example, from the federal government, you would not get an award for $100,000 where the federal government gave you the $100,000 up front and you spent it over the next year or so. Instead, most federal awards are cost reimbursable. So you incur the cost and then they pay you for it. Typically, you can draw down those funds or get access to those funds on a monthly basis. And then if you have any contributions to the project, so space or services that you've donated, so you're not charging the federal government, but your organization or others who are working on or collaborating on the project are donating, then you have to make sure you have appropriate documentation of those contributions. If we look at purchasing, under uniform guidance, your purchasing system has to have written policies and procedures, as we've said, basically your entire system needs to. You have to only incur costs that are necessary in a cost-effective way. So this is what lends universities, for example, for having policies about the lowest bid. That's to ensure cost effectiveness. You have to have competition and an open review process and a sort of specified way to make selections for vendors from whom you are making purchases. You have to have written standards of conduct, as I mentioned, so you don't have any kickbacks or bribes or unfair determinations made in your purchasing. And then you have to have documentation that shows that you paid a reasonable amount. You have a rationale for the cost that you actually paid a vendor for the services that they provided to you. Internal standards are a repeating theme. So you have to make sure that you only pay approved invoices from vendors to make sure that they are for what you actually purchased. You have to have your cash receipts recorded immediately and deposited in a timely fashion. As we mentioned before, you have to have separation of duties and timely reconciliation of your expenditures and the related revenue. And you have to have systems in place for monitoring the performance of the work that's being funded by the federal government to make sure that you stay within the grant timelines and meet any milestones or deliverables that might be included in the award you receive. If you have those collaborators or another institution who's working with you on your project, a subrecipient, you are responsible for communicating with them to make sure that they understand what the compliance requirements are. You have to make sure that if there are any risks associated with them, so perhaps they've never had federal funding before, that you put proper documentation requirements on them so that you have a reasonable assurance that the federal funds will be used properly. You have to make sure that they do the reporting that's required in your award from the federal government, and that they take any actions that might be necessary if they find any deficiencies or problems in the work or the accounting of the funds. And yeah, that's your requirement. So basically, it's your requirement to understand your own award and then make sure that the subrecipients also understand the requirements and expectations of the federal government. Audit standards, it's commonly said within the audit world that grantees are expected to maintain a state of audit readiness. So what that means is that you don't want to get ready for an audit right before an audit happens or while an audit is going on, but rather you have those records and policies and procedures in place so that you're ready when an auditor comes. You can provide the documentation and rest assured that you are compliant. If you don't provide the auditor with reliable information, and there end up being questioned costs, you could have cost disallowances and have to refund money to the federal government. So some of the problems that auditors have found in other organizations, I thought might be helpful to you to get some sense of what are auditors really looking for, what might cause them concern. So some examples are personnel costs charged to grant projects that weren't supported with documentation. So there was no record of how the individuals spent their time that could be tied to the amount of salary that was actually charged to a federal award, for example. The reported grant costs did not agree with the accounting records. So the financial status reports were not prepared directly from the ledger, but instead were maybe manually put together. And in-kind contributions of goods and services were not supported with appropriate documentation so that the value of those donations or contributions could readily be ascertained by the auditors. Others were no documented basis to support the amount allocated to the project for indirect costs. So, for example, if you have rental costs and you're doing a number of different projects in the same building, there needs to be an allocation of space to the particular federal award so that the federal government isn't expected to pay for the entire cost of the entire building. There is a requirement to have some independent audits. And so if you haven't done those, that's definitely a red flag for auditors. And that it could be that your financial management system lacked adequate internal controls. So for example, you put all the funding for several projects into one account and didn't have appropriate segregation of sources of funds. And then if you fail to spend any advances or the cash that you receive from the federal funds in a timely manner. So you wouldn't want to, for example, include a lot of costs in a drawdown of funds and then intentionally reverse all of those just so you would have cash on hand. That would not be appropriate, and that would be something that would trigger the auditors to have concerns. So these are general risks that are associated with an ineffective grants management system or program. So you could end up misusing grant funds and having to repay money. Most commonly, that has to do with documentation. specific to that grant not being available. You could maybe not even meet your grant objectives, and you might misrepresent your grant results. If you don't have good records, good ways to account for what you've actually done, and a way to really account that you've spent the money to accomplish what it is you wanted to accomplish. You might end up violating either federal regulations or the terms and conditions of your award, which could impact your funding from that particular federal agency. There can be reputational damage from grant misuse. Audit results from the federal government are publicly available, so there is the potential for information being out to the public about your ineffective grants management system, for example, and then you might actually lose federal funding. So it's really important to self-identify weaknesses and take proactive measures for remediation throughout your grant management process, rather than finding problems at the end of a grant, for example, when the auditors come, or perhaps discovering that you have a huge gap in your accounting structure that impacts the charges you actually made. There's lots of benefits, though, to having an effective grants management program, which is really the point I want to pretty much leave you with today, because staying compliant, having these things in place, not only gets you a federal award, but it bolsters your chances of getting future grant funding. So you can meet the eligibility requirement, you can assure the federal government that you have the wherewithal to actually comply with the regulations. You get an ongoing relationship with that federal sponsor who recognizes, oh yeah, they get the work done, they do it properly, they only charge us what they're supposed to charge us, we don't have any problems with them, let's fund them again. It also reduces the real dollars your organization has to put out to perform your services or your programs. If you can get federal funding for your services and programs, then that enables you to use your organization's dollars for other purposes. You might be able to expand your programs or services if you have that particular situation, and then it does keep you out of trouble from the federal government, which I think is always a key factor. So I want to give you an opportunity to ask any other questions. Was there something you didn't hear that you have a question about? Was there something you heard now that we've gone through all the slides that you want to circle back around to? The idea was not at all to scare you. Getting financial or federal awards, financial assistance can really, really benefit your organization. You just have to be cognizant of the rules that go along with getting those funds, and then proactively look at your organization in terms of its systems, its structures, its processes to ensure that you can be compliant if you get that federal award.
So Kim, this is Jennifer. I know this can seem very overwhelming because it's a lot of information, and we really appreciate you sharing this with everybody. But I think the one thought that I would like to leave with everybody too is that you probably already have a lot of these things in place, maybe not the registrations at the very beginning, but you already have a lot of your policies and procedures. They just may not be in one solid location. So it's just gathering all of those pieces together and putting it in one place, so that in case you were able to apply for a federal award, you'd be able to quickly pull that information together and show it to the federal government if they requested to see it. So you already have a way that you're processing payroll. It's just you may not have written down the process. So, you can write down the process. You probably already have somebody doing your taxes as a nonprofit, and they may be preparing a financial statement. So I think those things are all probably happening in most of your organizations. It's just assigning somebody to pull it all together into one cohesive package that that you can use. Do you agree with that, Kim?
Absolutely, I do agree with that. And I think understanding the specifics of the federal requirements can help you hone or tweak the processes that you already have, right? So perhaps you do track, obviously you pay people, perhaps you do track how they spend time, but you may very well track that in terms of the program that they're involved in or the service that they provide, not the specific source of their funding. So when you got a federal award, for example, you would need to be able to provide that distinction or additional information within your tracking. Other
Any
questions?
any other questions? Well, Kim, thank you very much for this information. It was valuable and very informative. And we really appreciate you coming here to share this information and present.
Thank you for the invitation. Sorry for the interruption. Thank you for the invitation. I am available as a resource. If you have questions, I may not know the exact answer. I can hopefully point you in the direction of someone else who might know the specifics. But my knowledge of getting ready to receive federal funding is available to you if you would like to reach out to me. Oh, I think I saw a question.
Yes, the slides will be mailed to everybody post-session here. And let me just share my information here about getting continuing education credits.
So can there is one question I'd like
Sure,
to
absolutely.
from Shelley. It says, for the purposes of whether an organization needs an audit, how do you determine the amount of federal funds you receive? For example, we are a contractor with HEAL, not a subrecipient. Would that be considered federal funds? We receive core funding. How would we know if those are federal funds to us? I'm going to defer to Jennifer since she knows how the HEAL funds are flowing.
Right. So if you are a vendor, which is Shelley, in your case for HEAL, you're a vendor. So you would not have to consider that part of the federal funds that you're receiving. But as a subrecipient of the Kentucky Opioid Response Effort funds, that is federal funding because it is flowed to the state from the federal government and then from the state to you. So you would be considered a sub, I believe, in that case.
Yeah, I would agree. There is a distinction between being a vendor who is providing the goods or services that you normally provide, and a subrecipient who is actually doing part of the programmatic work that the federal government is funding.
Correct.
Okay, thank you all so much. Thanks for spending time with me.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, so just wanted to review how to get your CE credits. Let me just pull up here and add this to the chat box. So I have a link in here. So if you need a certificate of attendance or you need your certificate for if you're a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, just visit this link here, and I have it in the chat box right now, or you can scan the QR code to get your certificate. For all of the others that are getting CE credit, you would visit here the CE Central Get Credit website and enter this activity code. Now, if this is the first time you're using CE Central, you do have to register for the account. It takes less than a minute to fill out the information, and it is free, but there is a requirement that you do register. And there in the link, there is that number and the link for the website. We do have a feedback survey form that we'll be sending out, and it is the link right here in the chat box. Let me just go ahead and share that here. We do encourage you to fill this out. We are interested in your feedback on this session and what would you like to see in future sessions. So if you could, oh sure, Sonia, I'll do that right in just a couple minutes here. I'll go back to it. And so if you could just spend the time to fill out that survey, we really appreciate that. And for some of you that have not gone to the first grants session where we had the basic grant writing and how to write a development proposal, you can get the recording, and here is the link for that. In the chat box, we do record and register your name and just verify that you are a Wave 1 county, and then you will get a recording for that session. And then I think I have just a little bit more information to share. Thompson Grant does have a session going on next week, March 2nd and 3rd, that you may be interested in on grants. And I will share that in a post-session email, that link, and you'll receive that later this afternoon. And one more information I want to share. Oh, that's just a financial disclosure for everything. So let me go back to Sonia here so you can get the QR code. Hopefully you can pick that up. And then just to let you know, for our future sessions, next March 15th, we are having a session on MOUD, implementing best practices in the criminal justice system. And that will be at 2:30 in the afternoon. The invites will be going out today. And then April 6th, we'll have advocacy training. So we hope to see you at this event. So thank you all for showing up today, and look forward to seeing you in the future sessions. Have a great day, everybody. Sonia, I hope you got the QR code. If you didn't, let me know and I can post that again.